So feeling constantly exhausted, detached from your work, more importantly, questioning like, hey, did I even make the right decision to get to the job am I in, is not an uncommon feeling. You know that 60% of people suffer from what we consider burnout across the country. And it's a phenomena that affects us physically, that affects us emotionally, and it is a stark reason, especially for a lot of, especially healthcare providers, that you see them saying, you know what, I got to do something different. So today we're going to talk about burnout and its components. If you're a long, I got to stress that. If you're a long time listener of the podcast, we actually had a series a few years ago where we just kind of talked to different professionals, medical students, even residents on what their thoughts of burnout was. And fast forward a few years later, a lot of these feelings still hold the same. So today, let's talk about burnout, and more importantly, let's talk about the signs so we can kind of recognize it. Because it's one thing to be just tired, just have a bad day. It's one thing to have a bad day at the job. It's another thing to absolutely dread the fact that you gotta go in your car to drive to work. That is a huge spectrum that I want us to really kind of identify, because, and I'm gonna say this, and I hate to say it, sometimes the way to get over said burnout is to leave, right? And I'm not telling people to go and quit. I don't want you to say, hey, I saw Dr. Barry, he said, I'm feeling this way, I need to quit. I don't want you to go do that, right? Obviously, talk to your family, make sure your financial situation is one where that's even possible. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's really not. So I want to give some tips on, like, if it's not possible to leave, like, hey, these are some things that you could possibly do to feel a little bit better and have a little bit less stress, right? So stay with me today for another episode of Medicine Mondays as we discuss this phenomena of burnout and how it's affected us worldwide. So I have my notes over here, so I want to make sure I quote correctly, right? So the World Health Organization classifies burnout as an occupational phenomena resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Does that fit the definition that you may be thinking about when we hear burnout? Because I don't want people to think it's this new catchphrase, the kids are getting lazier, they don't want to work as hard. No. Some of that may be true, right? But no, we're talking about affects people at multiple different levels in the sphere of working. And as a physician, and I used to be a program director, so I've seen it at the medical student level, at the resident level, at the attending level. I see it with my patients who come to see me. I see it with my patients who are so stressed, they end up having a heart attack or stroke. So I see it in all different facets of life, occupation, outside of occupation. I don't want people to assume that this is just some new word that the young kids made up to try to get out of work. This is not the case. Burnout is very, very real. And if we don't do a great job, I don't even say a good job, if we don't do a great job, like recognizing the symptoms, recognizing how it can affect not only the person who's being burnt out, but everyone around them, and eventually like their family members and the loved ones, we will continue to run into these problems. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't brush this off. This is a problem that, I hate to say it, is going to have a lot of us, especially in the healthcare field, leaving this place earlier than expected. All right, so before I get into recognizing what are the physical and the emotional signs associated with burnout, I want to talk a little bit about my journey, right? Because I think a lot of times it's much easier if you can kind of relate to a story when you're trying to follow such a complex problem, right? So I remember this was the pandemic. This was early pandemic timeframe, right? This is early pandemic timeframe where the work hours were super long, and especially in the beginning, our success rate in taking care of a patient wasn't the greatest. And as a physician whose sole purpose and job is to take care of the patient and make sure that patient can get home, when you're having more losses than wins, it can kind of pile on. So I started noticing a lot of my colleagues, especially my attendings, but more importantly, of those in my allied health professionals, my nurses, my respiratory therapists, my speech therapists, my physical therapists, my other nurses, I just started noticing that everyone around us started feeling the same thing. We were starting to ask ourselves, hey, you know what? is this enough? Because the love of why we went into the profession, we just wasn't seeing it, right? And again, because COVID was COVID, right? We weren't seeing like the love. We weren't seeing the happiness. We were seeing way more sad faces. We were having way more complications. And it really starts having you ask that question like, all right, man, like, yeah, I got to do another 12 hours. I got to do another 8 hours. Like, I got to go see another patient who may not make it throughout the day. So that time frame, right? Because before, when we would think about burnout, we would always think like, all right, this is some issue that affects people who've been out practice for, 15, 20 years, and they're just kind of tired of it and they want to do something different. No, we were seeing medical students, we were seeing residents, we were seeing early allied health professionals who didn't even have 5 years into their career already trying to figure out a way to get out. And it was a problem that I saw. We had a lot of people move, a lot of people transfer, a lot of people trying to figure out like what their next step was because they just could not see medicine, even because one, we probably couldn't see that there was going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. But even those who knew that, yes, there was going to be a light at the end of the tunnel, they didn't want to have to wait till the light got there to start thinking about other options. And for the first time, for a lot of people, they really started thinking about other options. Like how many of you, right, are sitting at your job and like, man, I am just not happy here. I feel way more stress here. It's a burden on my heart. And the decision you have to do is leave, but you won't even take that next step, right? Because again, me, I'm a big action taker, right? You won't take the action steps needed to move on because you fear that level of uncertainty that's on the other side. I can tell you for a lot of the healthcare professionals, I don't think they cared about the level of uncertainty on the other side. They just wanted to get away from this existence of what they thought medicine was or what they thought medicine was supposed to be, and it wasn't. And I think when we think about other professions, whether you're a teacher, you work in administration, whether you work with your hands, you're doing physical labor, like you always go into it with one mindset. And then once you get there, once the curtain gets pulled back, you're like, I did not know it was going to be this bad, right? Like, especially for those who feel it. So it is an issue that affects us all, even those who are in love with what they do, right? Because I don't want you to think that just because let's say a physician, right? Just because a physician really loves what they're doing doesn't mean that they don't have these same types of feelings of like, oh man, I got to do this again, right? Like, no, they still have it. Now, of course, fortunately, they're not severe enough where they have to leave, or they figure like, all right, there's nothing else I'm really going to do that's probably going to pay me this amount of money, so I'm stay here, right? So, and that could be an option as well too. And sometimes you see it in your, I don't want to say ornery type physicians and healthcare providers, but those who you could tell they're really only here for the check. And a lot of times that's what happens, right? They say, hey man, I hate being here, but I love the money more. I just got to do what I got to do, right? So think about a journey that you may be experiencing, you or friend or family member experiencing when you're thinking about this aspect of burnout, and more importantly, am I feeling the burnout, right? Because I want to talk about the different signs and symptoms associated with burnout, so everyone can kind of get a real handle of what to expect, or really more importantly, what to look for. All right, so when we talk about the signs of burnout, becoming aware of the signs and symptoms of the burnout are the first step in being able to effectively manage the aspect of being the person who is burnt out. So let's talk about some of the physical stressors that you may be experiencing, right? I got them over here, right? Chronic fatigue, sleep disturbances, right? How many people sleep patterns are just absolutely trash associated with the fact that all right, I got to go to this job here. I sleep in late, or I'm sleeping, I just can't get enough sleep for the angst that I got to go to this place here, right? Headaches, a lot of GI related issues. You'd be surprised how many people used to see me in the office and would just have these just random GI complaints when they go to work, that when we do our battery of testing, there was nothing to be found, right? Just battery of testing, and we can't find anything. But it always happened once they got there, right? So there are some physical stressors that the body has to endure when dealing with this aspect of burnt out, right? And that's why I stress it is not just a mental thing. It's not something that it's only in your head. Your body reacts to you being in an environment that you don't really want to be in. How many of us feel a certain way when we have to go to a place that we don't really want to go. Starting to get a little body ache, starting to get deep sighs, starting getting that one headache that is right here when we know we got to go to a place that we're not supposed to go to or that we don't want to go to, right? So the body will have physical reactions to a situation or to an environment that's really causing harm to you, even if you think the only harm it's causing to you is from an emotional standpoint, right? So definitely want to make sure that you understand that yes, you can definitely have some physical manifestations associated with your burnout that your body just kind of will portray in a certain way that it's a lot of time it's vague, a lot of time it's non-specific, but the only, again, central aspect of the issue is that the environment, or what's causing the problem, which is usually the terrible job in that front, right? Or a terrible relationship, right? Don't think about those. I don't want y'all to think this is just an occupational related thing, even though it is associated with it, right? If you're in a bad relationship, you can get a lot of burnout symptoms associated from a bad relationship as well, too. All right, so let's talk about some of the emotional signs of being burnt out, right? This is a good one, right? Not good, but cynicism, becoming detached from work and your personal life, and this feeling of hopelessness, this feeling I do not want to have to clock into work today. I do not want to have to get on the road to go to work, right? I do not want to have to wake up out of my bed to get ready. You see how far back I keep moving it? It doesn't just happen when you pull in the parking lot, right? The second you wake up with the understanding that, hey, I got to get ready to go to that place that isn't a very good place for me, emotionally, you start feeling it, right? And I like this aspect of it, of this detachment, right? You don't even feel like you're yourself when you are there. You don't feel like you're yourself when you're at home. You just feel man, I got to do this again, right? And again, when it gets to that level, and of course there's varying degrees, but when it gets to that level, this is when I implore my people to start looking for others, right? Even my physicians, and I know, yes, the salary is great, but this salary is going to kill you and you're not going to last long. You're not going to even last long enough to enjoy it, right? Because you're so super stressed and so worried and so detached from what's really going on. And it's the fact that you are not happy and the place that you're going to is causing more harm than good. All right, so let's talk about some of the behavioral aspects associated with it. We kind of talked about the emotion, we talked about the physical, but when we think about some of the behavioral changes that you start to experience once you're starting to get burned out, because remember, when we first start the job day one, everything is all good. Once we're at DEFCON level 10 of the burnout, those things that used to be all good, you hate every single one of it, right? So when we think about some of the behavioral issues associated with burnout, let's say you're an employer, right? You start recognizing, hey, you know what? This person is taking a lot longer to do tasks than they used to normally do. This person is procrastinating a lot more to try to avoid the simple tasks, doing more work in procrastination than actually doing the task because they just don't want to do the task. So you start seeing these pieces of you that used to be great, that slowly start chipping away, that slowly start being, again, detached from the reality of who you are personally, because you're just trying to manage and cope with this constant state of being that you feel hopeless. You feel why do I have to be here? That's why the aspect of burnout is so encompassing, right? Because you may not necessarily have all three levels. You may be to the point where on the behavioral scale, you're a 10, you procrastinate everything all of a sudden takes you forever to do, or you avoid it at all costs, right? You could just be very emotionally invested with it. And then some people just have it all, right? Where they just physically feel sick, emotionally feel sick, their behaviors are changing. All of these things kind of are wrapped into this bundle of the case of a person being burnt out. And I think a lot of it, especially as a healthcare provider, especially I can tell you in healthcare, this is a topic that gets talked about a lot. We have classes on it. We go to conferences. There's usually a lecture or two on it. And because we, especially in the healthcare, we recognize this is an actual problem. This is a problem that we've likely been kicking down the road for so long that now it's piling up. And we have to address it now. We can't even go down the road anymore. The road is full. The road is blocked. The obstacle is there because we kicked this problem down the road for far too long. So we're trying to aggressively address it, recognize it, and try to give some tips to try to help manage it and minimize it. Is going to be the supply issue of credible people who are educated to do a job is only going to get worse if all of the best people feel overworked, overstressed, and they're like, I got to do something different. So understand that you got some physical, you got your emotional, you got your behavioral issues, and these are all signs and symptoms that we typically will look for, or as a healthcare provider, we will ask about when trying to determine like, all right, like where are you at on this burnout scale, and like how much work do we need to do to try to get you back off that ledge. So I love this aspect here when we start thinking about recognizing it, more importantly, trying to prevent it, right? Like I love some of these tools here that I want us to kind of think about and see how we can incorporate this in our daily lives. I know the people who watch this or listen to me, I'm not only talking to healthcare providers, right? Obviously, I'm talking to my patients all across the world, right? Who I don't have a medical relationship with, right? But I feel like I do because you guys are always here checking me out, right? So understand that this applies to every profession. Anyone can use some of these tactics or tricks to try to help prevent it or even just recognize the symptoms are there, right? Because I love this, right? Let's talk about the stages of burnout. There's a honeymoon phase where you have high job satisfaction, your commitment and energy, creativity levels are through the roof, right? Like for some of y'all, how long does that stage last, right? Honeymoon phase. Then there is the stage 2, where it's the onset of stress, right? Where you have what you used to be very optimistic about, it starts to wane. Right. And, speaking of just medicine in general, we have studies that show that the optimism from a first year medical student starts waning by the time they're a fourth year. These folks haven't even gotten to residency, haven't even gotten to the attending life. And from first year to fourth year in medical school, their optimism is much lower than it was when they first became a medical student. If that's not a problem, I don't know what is, right? Like, I just gotta say what I gotta say. Stage 3 is when you have the chronic stress, right? A change in your stress levels that are associated with more intense symptoms, right? And we kind of mentioned the symptoms on the last segment, right? So you start noticing you have this increase in stress, but all of a sudden, a lot of those signs and symptoms that you didn't even think about start following along with you, right? That's stage 3. Stage 4 is the burnout stage, right? Symptoms become critical and they become increasingly difficult to cope with them. Now, increasingly difficult doesn't mean you can't, but it becomes increasingly difficult to cope with them because you went through this highly optimistic honeymoon phase. You love everything about the job, you love everything about the people, and then you get to that stage where you're like, you know what? I don't really like everybody. They're cool, right? They're okay. The job's great. The pay's nice, right? To the point where like, oh man, I gotta go to work again. All right, maybe if I take the long way to work and maybe if I take an extra 5 minutes on this break, I'll do less work for me and I have to see these people less, right? So you can kind of start seeing just in my mannerism how like you start moving from stage to stage till you get to point to stage 4 where you like, you know what, man, F this job, right? Like I don't want nothing to do with this job here. Like I hate it, but they still pay my bills, so I'm gonna still be here, but like I don't like nobody there. I'm only talking to like one person and that one person there, and then I'm leaving, right? Like it just becomes this issue that continues to snowball till we get to stage 5 where you start having significant mental, physical, and emotional problems. So now it does not only become just about the job, it becomes about yourself, right? You become more stressed, you become more anxious, you be having more headaches, more GI complaints, more behavioral disturbances that not only affect yourself at the job, but you bring it home. It used to be a problem that the job was the issue. So when you had all of these changes, it only happened at the job. But now you get so bad, you get to stage 5, you get so bad, now the problems happen when you're home too. Now your significant other has to deal with the issues. Now your children has to deal with the issues. Now your immediate family member or extended family member has to deal with these same issues that the job caused. It's not even their fault. The job caused it. Now you're bringing it home, right? So that's the red alert where I say, hey man, we gotta leave that job. Like, yeah, they may pay you well, but we gotta leave that job because now you're affecting your loved ones who have nothing to do with the problems that you have. But you're like, you know what? I can't even turn this switch off no more. That is how bad it gets. And we have some practices that kind of from a solutional standpoint, there's a lot of self-assessment tools. I'm going to put a link to our blog post that we wrote on burnout, and I'll have some of the self-assessment tools in the blog post. There's some mindfulness practices. Y'all know me. I'm big on the mindfulness, right? I'm big on telling myself positive thinking and positive thoughts to try to get a positive outcome. I'm big on that. Trying to set boundaries at work, right? Learn to say no, schedule regular breaks, and committing to yourself that you're going to take those breaks. Don't take a break and still do your work. That causes you to stress and burn out. I'm talking to you doctors, right? Don't do that. If it's break, take your break, right? Don't bring your work with us. At the end of the day, you may need to get some professional help, especially if you run into a situation where I can't leave the job. I can't just leave this job here. They paid me and I'm talking back to my healthcare providers because I always get this excuse. Oh, they paid me too much, man. What other job am I going to do that's going to pay me like this? And I'm like, yeah, that's true. But what other job is going to put up with the person you are just because they're paying you what they're paying you? That's the question. What job is going to put up with all of this that you keep bringing because we have to deal with it? We don't want to have to deal with it, right? So understand that a professional, my therapist, shout out to my therapist, it may be a last resort, but for some people be the only resort that needed. Because don't get it twisted. If you do a bad enough job at work, they'll just get rid of you. And then you won't have to worry about that pay that was holding you there in the first place. Do a bad enough job, they'll get rid of you. Trust me. Because I can assure you, the people who aren't burnt out don't want to work with people who are burnt out. I want to say that again. The people who are not burnt out do not want to work with someone who is burnt out. So they'll find a way to get rid of you. They'll find a way to get you up out of there if you allow it. So understand that it is extremely important that if you get to that stage 5, we may need to seek some professional help. And whatever mental roadblocks you have of seeking professional help, you better get rid of it or the job will get rid of you. So today we explored some of the signs and symptoms associated with burnout. We talked about some of the physical, emotional, and more importantly, behavioral aspects. And more importantly, we talked about ways to try to dodge and weave it, right? Again, I'm going to have a self-assessment tool in the links of my show notes that I want you guys to really check out, because a lot of you are burnt out and you don't even know it. So I'll have an assessment tool for you guys because hey, you know what? I love you. This is what I do. But I want you to understand that, hey, this is what burnout looks like. It's not you in the sense that this is some internal thing that only you are experiencing. A lot of other people are experiencing. They may be on different stages. They may be on different parts of the stage, but a lot of people are actually experiencing the same stuff you're experiencing. So do not hesitate if it ever gets to that point and you need some help, to go get you some help, right? But today, just start out with doing the assessment so you understand where you're at. If we don't recognize our signs and symptoms, if we don't recognize we may be burnt out, we won't recognize when it's time to get some help. And I want you to get that. So I'm yours truly, Dr. Barry Pierre. Thank you for joining another amazing episode with myself truly and the Lunch and Learn community. I'm going to see you guys next week.